Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Coffey, and as the Associate Director of NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual event celebrating Lauren Sandler's newest book, This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in with us tonight. I'd also like to thank a few key people at IPK who have made this virtual event possible. Arivel Figueroa, Sam Dijon, and Zari Lum. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge and send gratitude to all of our essential workers and first responders across the globe. Tonight, we celebrate Lauren's This Is All I Got, which immerses its readers in the life of a young, homeless, single mother amid her quest to find stability and shelter right here in New York City. Lauren is an award-winning journalist, essayist, and author. This is her third book, and she has written about inequality in its many forms for publications, including The New York Times, New York, The New Republic, The Nation, Slate, and Salon, and has worked as a producer at NPR. Tonight, Lauren will be in conversation with New York Times nonfiction critic, Jennifer Szalai, previously an editor at The Book Review and a senior editor at Harper's Magazine. Our event tonight will run for about 1 hour, beginning with a conversation between Jen and Lauren, followed by Q&A from all of our viewers. Please remember to post your questions on IPK's Twitter feed at NYU_IPK. With no further ado, I pass the mic to Jen to get us started. Thank you again and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Hi, Lauren. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if maybe to start off, you could just give us a few sentences about, what the book is about and how you got into the subject.
Sure. This Is All I Got is a work of narrative nonfiction. My goal was to write a book that read like a novel in which every word was true. And it follows the journey of a really remarkable young woman named Camila, or who I call Camila. That's not her real name. Through her search for housing, through her quest to stay in school while finding stability at the same time, through our social service system, and also through, just what it means to be a 22-year-old with no margin of error while having ambitions and a new baby. My goal was less to focus explicitly on homelessness, though it is certainly a book about that, and more to think about the whole constellation of factors that leaves her homeless, which is an interlocking crisis of our welfare state, of race and gender discrimination, of the unequal burden that falls to women, and of course, our incredible housing crisis.
So you met Camila in 2015, and you met her in a shelter. And I was wondering how you came to that shelter and how you decided that she was somebody that you wanted to write about.
So I knew I wanted to write about homelessness. I felt like we were living through, and still are, and now worse than ever, I'm sure, a real human rights crisis that was going unfelt, not totally undiscussed. We were talking about big issues, big data points, but I didn't feel like readers had many opportunities to experience through the process of narrative what daily life, what those actual struggles felt like. And so I started reaching out to various organizations that I hoped would help me connect with city shelters in New York. City shelters in New York do not permit journalists, full stop. It's an abomination. Our tax dollars support them. It's a massive public institution that goes completely unobserved by the public because it's completely unobserved by journalists. And if I had a bigger bank account or a bigger institution or any institution supporting this work, I would bring a nice big lawsuit against the city. Instead, I reached out to private shelters, and I found a shelter in Park Slope, which I wasn't looking to find a shelter in the sort of cultural apex of artisanal motherhood, but that's where I found it. The contrasts present themselves. And I met with a woman who runs this very small shelter, which is mainly volunteer run. It only has a couple staff members. And she basically said, great, come, do whatever you want. I just need someone to run our Wednesday night meetings. And I said, what's the Wednesday night meeting? And she said, well, that's when all the residents come and sit with their babies and talk about their week and what's going on. We have a guest speaker. Don't worry, it's the one thing you got to do. And then once you do that, you can do anything you want here. I was surprised after so much red tape to find, this sort of dyed-in-the-wool New Yorker who just sort of said, great, welcome. So it also raised sort of a complicated ethical problem, though, right? Was I working for the shelter or was I working as a journalist? And was I going to witness things as a volunteer that people might not want to show me as a reporter? And so that became a line to walk that I was very aware of from the start. I didn't take out my notebook for weeks, even though I did talk about my purpose there. I let every woman I met there tell me whether they wanted to be represented or not, and told them that they could change their minds at any point if they wanted to. And I really did stick with that, which was frustrating at times as a journalist, but it felt essential ethically as a person who was already in such a disproportionate position of power in that situation. There were 4 women who came forward and said, yeah, I'm open. Let's spend some time together and see how this works. And amongst those 4 women, all of whom are fascinating, extraordinary women who I was so happy to get to know, and all of whom are represented in the book, there was Camila. And Camila and I just had a spark together. I think that so often we talk about nonfiction writers and filmmakers choosing their subject as though that's a one-way choice. But of course it isn't. It's about a certain alchemy. It's about chemistry. It's about people wanting to open up to each other. And Camila really wanted to open up to me. And so she pulled me into her life and I wanted to be there. And we had a connection from the start. The other women who I had the privilege to write about took sort of a supplementary role to that. And then when Camila was evicted from the shelter, it became this moment in which I needed to decide whether the setting of the book was going to be the shelter or whether it was going to be following her. And because she was so remarkable to me, I decided that that was where the book needed to go. Camila is someone with a brilliant mind, incredibly organized, tenacious. She was a criminal justice student when I met her and worked very hard to maintain that, that role through the whole process of the book, as readers will see. And she just really knew the system cold. She's someone who had sued her parents for child support when she was a teenager and won. She was someone who, when she was in foster care on Staten Island and going to college in Manhattan, said, this commute is insane, this place is abusive, I'm getting out of here, and rented her own room and graduated early. It really seemed to me, and also to every caseworker she'd ever met or every professor, that if she couldn't make the system work so she could get out of it entirely, that no one could. And so I wanted to find out if indeed that was a possibility.
And, one of the things that I was struck by when reading your book, it comes up from the very beginning that Camila is, she's extremely sharp and she really sort of understands what her rights are within this system that is really labyrinthine and difficult to navigate. And one of the things that was also interesting, Camila is the main, figure in this book, understandably, but also, you do spend quite a bit of time with some of the other people in her life, including the woman who runs the private shelter, who's named Rose. And one of the things that struck me is that Rose comes across, at least to me, as quite a complicated figure. I mean, she's devoted her life to helping these women in this shelter. But at the same time, she's really suspicious of Camila. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit, because I found it fascinating.
It's so interesting when I speak to early readers about the book. I
Yeah.
know this came out today, but there are some people who've been able to read it, who I've pushed it at. And there's such a variety of responses about Rose. There are some people who I just touched my face. That means something so different now. There are some people who feel like, wow, what a tough cookie. She really had to lay it down. And there's some people who think, whoa, that doesn't seem like the way to deal with women in poverty. Rose is someone who would tell you, and again, that's also not a real name, but the woman who I know as Rose would tell you that she had been around the block. She had been doing this work for decades. She still does. She had seen it all, dealt with every drama, worked at huge organizations, you name it. And she was dealing with a very small shelter filled with very big personalities, and a shelter that was in Park Slope, Brooklyn, where, the 200 odd bucks that it cost to pay for that shelter a month, most people were paying for it out of public assistance funds. That was a real get to have what felt like a bit of a studio apartment in her mind in prime Brooklyn. And she really wanted to make sure that there weren't people who were trying to pull one over her just because they had a challenging life. She also knew, because she has been through it all before, that there are a lot of people who can cause trouble. There are a lot of people who, need a lot more support than the shelter can offer. The shelter offers this Wednesday meeting and a room with a private bathroom and kitchen, which is unheard of practically. But it doesn't offer what's called supportive housing, which is housing for the homeless that provides mental health support or help finding housing or anything like that. So her deal was, I'm trying to keep this thing running. We have a soup kitchen downstairs. We got these rooms upstairs. Can't have any drama, can't get used by anyone. The rules are the rules. And if you don't like them, then there's a whole public city system that can take you in. And at times, I would find the way that she enforced her rules, she would call herself the enforcer, to be a little puzzling and a little tricky. But at other times I would think, yeah, she's the reason that all these women are here. She's saved this shelter from collapse, and she's doing things that they're not even aware of that are possible. And authority figures are tough sometimes. So yes, I agree. She's a complicated one. And I think that working on that very grassroots level, running an institution, which is so small and so intense, is going to be a complicated job.
Right. Well, I think what was also interesting is because, in addition to Rose, we meet some of the other women who live in the shelter who, you know, all the women in the shelter, from what I understand, they all have children. Is that correct?
Mhm. The
It's for
shelter
women
is
with
right.
children?
So you
Okay.
can, if you were accepted into the shelter, you can move in during your last trimester and you can
Which,
stay for 1 year.
okay.
And that's it. So depending on when you check in, your baby's between 9 months old and 12 months old when you check out. So it's
Right.
also a very intense time of life. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Right. And one of the things that does come up um, is the fact that Camila, when you meet her, she is in her last trimester. She's about to have her baby. She has her baby Alonzo, a little boy, and she had lived in a shelter in New Jersey before. She had dealt with homelessness because, from what I understand, her mother had essentially kicked her out when she was a teenager. Is that
That's correct.
right?
And she had
And,
a state in a shelter in Washington Heights, I believe. Maybe it was Harlem, actually,
okay.
when she was younger.
So
But
she had sort of been in and out of the system.
yeah.
And once she has the baby, though, that adds a whole other layer, I mean, it's one way of putting it, I guess, of things that she has to deal with, things she has to think about. Um, I was wondering if maybe we could talk about that, because I feel like there were different points in the book where complications come up for her and she realizes, oh, wait a second, this was something that when I was without a kid, I could have just picked up and left, or, figured it out, or gotten a part-time job in addition to going to school, because she's still going to school. That's a big part of it.
Mhm.
Um, so I was wondering about that. I mean, I mean, I guess go ahead if you want to,
I mean,
if you
there
want to
are
jump in.
enormous complications, and there
Yeah.
are complications for a person in poverty, which are, it's being strapped to an anvil. So, I mean, some of it is just logic, right? If you don't have a place to stay, you can crash with a friend much more easily if there's a couch available, not that there always is, if you don't have a baby. If you don't have an apartment to rent on your own, you can get an apartment with roommates. Craigslist will post something for an individual bedroom, and that is pretty simple to apply for if you can pay for it, which is still difficult, but it becomes very, very different once there's a baby in the mix. If you are staying in a shelter, like the one that she's staying in with the baby, there's a 9 o'clock curfew. And so working nights is impossible. One of the women in the shelter worked at the Applebee's in downtown Brooklyn, and she could only work lunch shifts that paid nothing because of the shelter curfew. But beyond that, there are very few daycares that will take children at night. And so, what it means to shoulder all of this is massive. And for the women in the shelter, and indeed the majority of homeless families, which make up the majority of homeless people in the United
Right.
States, we're talking about single mothers. So we're talking about people who are carrying that burden utterly alone.
Right. And, one of the things that I do remember at a certain point is that Camila tries to sign her child up for daycare in a daycare, I guess, near downtown Brooklyn. And she's told that the wait list is 2 years, which, is just impossible. And so she finds a place that takes the vouchers that she has. And at the same time, she has to go to school further into Brooklyn. So it's something like a 2-hour commute for her, it sounds like, from one place in the city
Well,
to the
once
other.
she's kicked out of the shelter in
Okay.
Brooklyn, she's still enrolled at a college in Brooklyn, all the way out past the end of the line, past the end of the Brighton Beach line. She used to take a bus from there, and then a school bus from the bus that's at the end of the line.
Right.
If you're dealing with a less privileged New York, you go past to the end of the line a lot.
Right.
And it's a very difficult commute. She was already enrolled in this program. She was living in an overcrowded apartment in the Bronx. And for a while, she was dropping her son off in downtown Brooklyn at daycare, taking the subway, the bus, and then the other bus, going to school, and then going to her work study job and doing it on the way back. And it was really something.
And so, in terms of her degree, this is something, her education, it's something that it's obviously very important to her, but it becomes clear that, once she has the child, everybody in the system whom she talks to is basically trying to steer her toward leaving school and getting a full-time job. I mean, that seems to be the way everything is oriented. And she's very clear why she doesn't want to do that. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit.
Sure. Once you're on public assistance, you need to prove that you're working full time or in school full time. And if you're doing neither, then you have to go to these job placement offices where you sit in a very crowded room for 8 hours a day with your child in daycare, waiting for your name to come up for a minimum wage placement somewhere. It could be a city job, the one that always comes up is referred to as picking up cans in the park.
Right.
People always say, I'm not going to just go pick up cans in the park, or they sent me out to go to pick up cans in the park. A lot of that work, when it's private, is home healthcare work, which is, again, entirely underpaid and very consuming. And so her options, it seemed, were to follow the advice of most of the people she talked to pick up cans in the park, or to sit in that job placement office while her baby was in childcare elsewhere, or to stick it out in school. And her ambitions for school, were to work in criminal justice when she graduated. She was part of the state justice I wanted to call it the Justice League right now, but I doubt that's actually what it's called. There is an official thrilling sounding name to the New York State Justice Academy that encompasses a number of schools. And once she graduated from her school in deepest Brooklyn, she was admitted into John Jay. She could have automatically walked into the best school for criminal justice in the country, except she could not find a place to stay, period. And because of that, it was not an option to her. But she knew that most people who work minimum wage jobs are on welfare, and many of them are homeless, that we don't pay a living wage, and that the idea of just scraping to get by, even if we did as a society, is not what she imagined for herself. And why should it be? She has this extraordinary mind. She has a desire to serve in our country. And frankly, pretty much all of the women that I knew from the shelter were remarkable in their own rights. One of them had a law degree from Russia.
Right.
One of them, was an incredibly talented photographer who wanted to do work in fashion, but again, was working the Applebee's lunch shift. The notion that people who are homeless are somehow lacking in talent or drive is such a fallacy. People who are homeless are usually people who are born to people who are poor in a
Right.
country that makes that more and more impossible, unless you want to make a life picking up cans in the park.
And I guess, that's another thing that, you realize when reading this book is, and that you describe it, by describing Camila's experiences through her own experiences, just the experience that she has of trying to navigate a system, even one that she knows really, really well. I guess one of the things that kept surprising me is that, well, first of all, how much she has to do in person. I was surprised how she would have to go to all these offices in person, wait for somebody to talk to that person, and that person would tell her to go to another floor in the building to talk to somebody else, or go to another building across the street to talk to somebody else, or go to some place in another borough to talk to somebody else. And even though she knew the system very well, there were a few times where she's really thrown for a loop that, because of some sort of paperwork issue, she's denied her benefits. I was thinking, for instance, um, she had filed a workman's compensation claim for a job that she had worked earlier. And finally, I think something like a year or two afterward, the money actually had come in. And for that reason, all of a sudden her benefits were cut off. Do I have that right?
That is part of the reason.
Okay.
But yes, that is certainly part of the reason. That, and even more to your point, that, there was a letter that was lost in the mail, clearly.
Right.
And I know it was lost in the mail because we would go to her post office box like almost every single day.
Which was the one constant address she
Yes.
had since she was a
So
teenager.
when she was in high school in Manhattan, she got herself a post office box across the street because she knew that any court documents, any state documents, etc.,
Right.
could not be emailed. They needed to be sent. And as long as she had that post office box, she would be able to stay on top of things. And so part of this commute, from the Bronx to Brighton Beach and stopping at downtown Brooklyn on the way, we would also often stop on 34th Street to go to the post office box most days. And there was a little bit of paperwork that said that she was missing some document, and she never got it. And because of that, she lost welfare, she lost childcare. We never quite figured out how she lost her Medicaid benefits. But this notion of everything happening in person, yes, even receiving a bit of mail is something that happens in person. And if you are homeless, that's an incredibly tricky thing. I remember when we went to the welfare office on 14th Street for 5 days. Once a week, we would go 5 weeks in a row, I believe, just to confirm that her rent subsidy check had been paid to the shelter. That was 5 days of her life. And when she was in school and working, that would mean missing exams. That would mean missing classes. That would mean missing work study jobs, often just to wait for hours to hear, oh, the person you need to talk to isn't in today, or your case has been transferred. There's this concept called administrative burden, that some scholars have put forth, that basically attests that the degree of complicated policy and this system that requires such an exceeding burden of having to show up, having to navigate, having to, deal in this purgatory, which is sometimes worse than purgatory. It's often hell, because welfare offices often don't even follow their own policies, is something that is systematically enforced to keep people from getting their benefits and to keep people out of the system. That it is a form of limiting the amount that we invest in our poorest Americans and driving people out of the
Right.
system entirely, but not towards anything else, just, towards a form, and I mean this in a very non-literal way, of madness, because the system is that crazy making.
And, connected to that, I was wondering, I don't know if you could speak to this, but, now we're living in a situation where offices are shut. I mean, nobody doing much in person for the most part. Do you know what's happening for people who are trying to access their benefits, who are trying to, you know,
Yeah,
Camila was doing in 2015?
it's unsurprisingly a nightmare. So there's one food stamp office currently open in each borough. Most of them are closed. Over half of the welfare offices are closed. And of course, they need to be for social distancing right now.
Right,
Um, at the same time, as we know, there are, 1.5 million newly unemployed people.
right.
New York City, 22 million nationally just in the past month. And that system has been completely overloaded. So where you can file online, the website crashes. When you can do something over the phone, there's, no way that you can get through. And this is where we are headed. I mean, when I think about how entirely overloaded and dysfunctional our social service system was in the best of times, right? In
Right.
unprecedented prosperity, which ended sharply, 6 weeks ago, but had lasted quite a long time. That was a time in which we could have strengthened our safety net. And instead, we shredded it. We shredded it systematically. And I know how impossible it is when those waiting rooms aren't full. I can only imagine how entirely devastatingly screwed we are, considering what is about to come and what has already begun.
Right. And I was wondering actually, because the way that this book is narrated, I mean, it's exactly what you talked about at the beginning of this conversation, which is it really does, you really are telling her story through her experience, through her eyes. You come into it a little bit, and we can get to that in a second because I think it's important.
Mhm.
But I was wondering if um, I did get the sense just from reading it that there was a lot of invisible research too that took place just in terms of your familiarity with policy. And did you talk to a lot of people who were actually, on the other side of it, who, are on the government side of the system, I guess, in terms of how they see it, where they see it going, um, whether it's the case that this is, I mean, is it the case that it is sort of this deliberate, starving of resources in order to make it just difficult for people to access? Or are there people who are really trying to strengthen it in some way?
I have to out myself. I didn't really. I mean, I did talk to some people, certainly, but I did not do an enormous amount of background interviewing in that sense. I read a lot of policy papers. I read a lot of studies. There is a huge amount of scholarship about how all of this functions. And I think it's got to be really, really maddening and heartbreaking to be a scholar who has devoted a lifetime of research to trying to shake people about this and
Right.
say, these are the problems and here's how we need to fix them. I don't think there's a university in America that doesn't have at least, I don't know, 2 or 3 people working on these issues at all times, not to mention the people who've been thinking about this in our government for years. So I did a lot of research in that way. I certainly, before I started reporting at the shelter, was doing a lot more general research. But I honestly, in addition to really drilling down into her experience and supplementing that with my own reading and some conversations, I didn't want to flag that I was in these offices doing this reporting.
Mhm.
Um, I would show up in pretty much any office, the child support office, the welfare centers, family court, the WIC offices, you name it. And I was almost always the only white person there, if not always, and almost always the only middle-aged person there, if not always. And I think you know, because Camila is pale and has a similar jaw to mine and curly hair, there was a lot of assumption that I was, as people called it, the grandmother,
Oh,
which
really?
in my early 40s really threw me for a loop.
Uh-huh.
When I wasn't considered to be the grandmother, ugh, um, I was often considered to be the social worker with her. I mean, people wouldn't say, "Are you the grandmother? Are you
Right.
the worker?" But there would sometimes be a little passing reference. And so that was really useful because I
Oh,
was
sure.
not in places where anyone wants a reporter. And in fact, when I would be reporting, I would either be recording on my iPhone because everyone has their iPhone out, or I'd often just be taking notes on the notes app because it would look
Right.
like I was texting all the
Texting,
time
and
because
people don't
everyone's
mind
doing
that.
that all the time.
Right.
But it wasn't often that I would take out one of my reporter's notebooks and a pen,
Right.
because my goal was to see what could be shown to me when people, were only showing it to Camilla.
Right. And you're with her. I mean, it seems like all the time. And I was wondering, one of the things that she really struggles with that's really, I mean, it's it's a really, in addition to all the, the the obvious things that she struggles with in terms of money and shelter and daycare for her child, is this question of loneliness and connection, because she's really, alienated or estranged, I guess, from a lot of her family. I mean, she desperately wants to have a connection, it sounds like, with her father in particular,
Mhm.
but he keeps blowing her off. Um, and you say at a certain point that you become, at least for the year that you're reporting on her life, you become one of her most sort of constant connections. And, you know, you do talk about the ethical boundaries, um, things that you had to think about. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Um, I could speak about that all night. I could take you through all my insomnia for years around those questions. Um, Let me begin this way. When I report, at least when I report in the way that I most want to report, in the way that I reported this book, it's not to interview someone, it's to hang out, and to see what gets revealed. I also am someone who believes that if someone is sharing themselves with me, I'm going to share myself with them. I relish the connection of reporting. And sometimes that connection can get a little complicated, especially when you care about the people who you're reporting about, which I often do. That's often why I'm reporting about them. And so, and add to that what it means to do, it's usually called immersion reporting, where you spend an enormous amount of time, often in very vulnerable situations with someone, and it's intense. And yeah, Camilla and I got very, very close, as I felt we should on a certain level, while I would still, in subtle ways, remind her, I'm taking notes. The recorder's on. Here's my notebook. But it's a complicated thing, especially, and I think that this is maybe one of the most important things to talk about in talking about the book, when our privilege is so, diametrically opposed. When I would leave the shelter or her overcrowded apartment in the Bronx or the WIC office and go back to my home in Brooklyn and have a very different life with my family than the one that she was getting to have. I write in the book, and I think about this a lot. My husband and my daughter have spent a massive amount of time with Camila and her son Alonzo, and care about her very deeply. And there was a moment in which she was getting evicted from her shelter, and it was clear that she might not have a place to land. And my daughter, who was then 8, was so furious with me that she was not coming to live with us. She could not find the word for the anger that she felt for what she wanted to tell me I was to my face. And that's when I taught her the word for hypocrite. And I think about that a lot, because what does it mean that I cared about this woman and I had a couch that she could crash on and I wasn't giving it to her? Part of that is because as a journalist, I needed to see how she would solve that problem for herself. And she did. That was what the book was about. I also know that that's not a permanent solution. And the larger issues here that's the point of this whole book, is what it means to live with utter systemic failure, what it means to live as a society with these issues that cannot be repaired by individuals, or at least individuals who don't have the last name Bezos or Gates or Zuckerberg, or Trump, I suppose. But that's a different story. And so it was this really tricky line that I would have to walk, because I did care about her so much and we were so close. I was thinking last night when I couldn't sleep about a book called All Our Kin, which I believe she was a sociologist named Carol Stack wrote in maybe the late 60s. And the way that she dealt with this is she cared for her protagonist baby, and her protagonist baby cared for her baby, and they lived together, and it was this very communal way of living like that. And maybe if my daughter had been Alonzo's age, that would have seemed like a solution in some way, but I don't think so, because the whole point was to witness it, but not witness it dispassionately. I think that, there's a big difference between dispassionate journalism and compassionate journalism. When I was worried about her son freezing during a very, very cold winter in which he didn't have a snowsuit, I knew that she had asked her father to buy Alonzo a snowsuit for Christmas, and I knew damn well he wasn't going to. I bought him a snowsuit. I didn't need part of the story to be Alonzo freezing to death. I was watching enough tragedy, and I was watching her solve enough on her own that one was a bridge too far for me. But these were all very delicate negotiations all the time. And I've really made a point to write about them all. I've really made a point to flag them in the book and wrestle with them a little bit. Not just so the book is more honest, but also because I think that it's a different conversation that we could be having around what it means to make nonfiction outside of the old rules of journalism, which are, this real separation. Because I think that real separation couldn't make a book like this. And it also just couldn't be who I am as a person. And that was important to me to be true to.
Yeah, one of the things I also was wondering when I was reading it was, because you do I think, such an amazing job of showing exactly what it is that she needs to do in order to sort of just survive in the system. But she's also she's so aware of the different parts of it, how it works, also how it's changed since she was a child, because her mother had a place in the projects, right? And
Well, her mother ended up with a place in the projects, but actually
okay.
through her whole childhood, her mother was able to pay the rent on just a private apartment in Corona where she grew up,
Right.
because she had Section 8. So Section
Right.
8 was the voucher system that, whether you were conservative or liberal, people agreed was a humane project, to help people in housing insecurity pay their rent.
And it doesn't
And
exist anymore, or
well,
it's
it exists in
suspended?
some places, but in New York City, there has been a wait list of 10,000 names since 2009, and the city will not add new names to the list because there are never new Section 8 cases that open. And scholars, HUD in the past, I mean, I'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't believe that vouchers, that housing vouchers, ways to help people pay rent in this, price gouging housing market, or even back in a different era when it wasn't so severe, that that's the way to prevent homelessness. And so her mother had Section 8. She was able to keep her kids in a stable apartment most of the time. There was a spell in which their landlord wouldn't take those checks because, government checks are things that feel stained in some way to so many people. But other than that, they had that stable apartment. And then her mom like hit the jackpot and got a place in the projects where Camila has been on the wait list since long before she had the baby. There are 100 and I believe 75,000 families on the wait list
Wow.
for public housing in New York, 250,000 people to, whose greatest hope, greatest dream is other people's worst nightmare, which is a life in the projects.
Right. Right. Well, I wanted to ask Jessica because I think we might have some questions from the audience.
We do. We do have
Okay.
questions. Thank you, Lauren and Jen, for this conversation. I'm halfway through the book and I cannot wait to finish. I'm going to pick it up right after this conversation. The first question is actually something I've been wondering. So, Lauren, you talk about the close connections and the relationships that you formed with Camila, especially, but also Rose and other women in the shelter throughout the year that you immersed yourself. I'm wondering how a project like this ends, right? What does that look like? How do you, first of all, step away physically? What are the logistics? But then emotionally and long-term relationship-wise, what does that look like?
It's a great question, and one that I still find myself navigating 5 years after I began the reporting in the shelter. It was always the arrangement with her that I was going to report her first year of motherhood, and that whatever happened beyond that was private. And I think it was really important. It was such a privilege that she gave me such full access to her life. And that's not something that can go on forever. At least it couldn't go on forever for us in that way. And I write, towards the end of the book about how there was a really clear time when I needed to step out of the journalist role and just be someone who knew her, and loved her. And, it's been like, I think, many relationships, an experience since the reporting ended, in which we go through periods where we're in touch a lot and we go through periods where we're not. And it ebbs and flows like any other relationship in many ways, but not as a relationship with a journalist and a protagonist anymore, but just two people who have known each other for some complicated years.
Mhm.
That the first year element is when the curtain fell down. Obviously, this is a story that doesn't have an end until she has an end. And at that point, the story is carried forth in her son's story, et cetera, where all these sort of continuations of each other's stories. I think a lot and write a lot about how much privilege and poverty in our country is determined by our inheritance in every sense of the word. how we were raised and by whom, whether there's an emergency fund for us, whether there's a down payment for a house or a college fund, that in this hideously unequal system, it's all an inheritance game. And so, the stories of what we inherit prolong this story sort of infinitely. And I needed to have a time to bring the curtain down. So Alonzo's first birthday was that time. And I think organically within the narrative, it actually was the right time to end the book.
Thank you. One of our viewers is wondering, it's a twofold question about Camila. One, throughout the year that you knew her, what kept her and her son, going as she overcame so much? And then where is Camila now? What is she up to today?
I mean, what kept her going is just tenacity like I've never seen in anyone. Her drive it's just extraordinary. And so she kept her going. She kept them going. She is now in she's now in different circumstances. She got married, and that has afforded her a measure of stability that she couldn't find on her own as someone who was really trying to make it work on her own. That's not why she married. She, married for love. But I do write about how it doesn't feel like an uncomplicated, happy ending to me. I'm happy that she found love, and I'm happy that she found stability, but I am appalled that she could not find stability without that.
And finally, one of our viewers asked about your next project, with your focus broadly on inequality and our current, our present situation, and what could you be working on next?
Any ideas?
I think I know.
I remain so obsessed with these issues that I imagine that they will probably lead me elsewhere. This book has been a really intense process for a long time. And, it just came out today, and writing a book, it's a thing. It's a real thing, writing a book. It's a huge commitment, and you have to want it so badly. Whenever I mentor people, I always say to them, there are three things I say you should never do unless you desperately want to do them. Write a book, move to New York, or have a baby. And I'm so thrilled to still be in New York and to be raising my baby, but I don't know what next book I'm committed to yet. I would love to talk to anyone about ideas they might have, though.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to say congratulations to Lauren once again on this feat of reporting and important work. To all of our viewers, This Is All I Got is available today, right? Today is the actual
day.
The actual day, from Random House Press. And as I said, I'm about halfway through the book, and I could not recommend it more. If either of you have anything you'd like to close with, you can go ahead, but I think we're just about finished up.
I just really want to thank you, Jessica, and I want to thank Jen. I want to thank the Institute for Public Knowledge. I want to thank everyone at Random House, and my family. It's incredibly meaningful for me to be able to talk about this book, even, at the desk where I wrote it, and really have an opportunity to connect around these ideas that I think are so essential right now. And I know that we're doing that remotely in this disembodied way, but I've really valued this conversation, and I'm just so honored and thrilled that we got to have it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Lauren and Jen, for such a fantastic conversation.
Did
Oh.
Jessica freeze?
Jessica froze.
Should we play her out then?
With what
Oh, no.
I've read,
she's
including
back.
reviews today.
Jess, we lost you for a minute, but I'm sure that what you said was very moving. Do you want to say it again?
I just want to say thank you very much for a fantastic conversation, and for spending your evening with all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, yes. Good night.
Thank you for hosting.
Absolutely.